Welcome, casemakers near and far. I'm Dr. Tiffany Manuel, and I'm the CEO and founder of The Case Made. One of the best things about the work that I do is that I get to travel the globe, and I get to hear amazing people who are doing the kind of things in their communities that are just so awesome. And when I hear great case making, there's only one thing that comes to mind: fierce. That's the energy of this series, and that's why I've invited you in. So come on in, take a listen. This is Fierce Case Making. Welcome everybody to this episode of Fierce Case Making, and I'm so excited. I'm literally like shaking because the interview that we did with Rasheedah Phillips is just outstanding. Just her discussion of the sort of time-space continuum is just amazing in terms of her body of work and scholarship around afrofuturism. And then I want you to listen for this conversation towards the end of it where we talk about interconnectedness and why that is so important. And I love the power of interconnectedness. Listen, folks, if you don't know how to wield that in your case making, you want to stick around, right, to hear us talk about that. Fantastic. All right, folks, here we go. Let's roll it up. Well, welcome everybody again back to the series Fierce Case Making. And I am joined today by a fabulous case maker. Y'all are in for such a treat. I'm joined by Rasheedah Phillips. Hi, Rasheedah. Say hi to everybody.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me.
In her formal role, Rasheedah is the Director of Housing for PolicyLink. And if you look at the bio that we put online for Rasheedah, you can see that she's won all kind of awards. She is, an advocate extraordinaire, but also just extraordinary legal counsel. Which means that she can play both roles. She both knows how to win in court, and she also knows how to win in the court of public opinion. So we love this conversation. And on top of all that, she is a self-described interdisciplinary afrofuturist artist and cultural producer who has exhibited globally. So I just know that there are many times I want to call with Rasheedah. I'm like, where are you? She's like, oh, I'm in Italy. I got it. I have all the things happening. I'm like, all right, well, let's do that. So welcome.
Thank you.
I'm so excited that you're able to join us today. So I want to just jump in. I think I first met you and heard you talk when we were both part of PolicyLink's kind of housing and health. I think, I don't know what it was called, but it was
Ambassadors for Health Equity.
There you go.
Yep.
That, what she said. And we were joined by a number of just amazing leaders from all over the country who were coming together for a period of time to talk about how we talk about health and housing, but also how we get in front of, in terms of the future state that we know is possible, right? If we all sort of, do the work that we know is right to do. And, I always say that I am a connoisseur of good case making. I can hear across a crowded room, right? When somebody is saying something that's, wait a minute, stop, what she just said. And I had that aha moment with you. You were on one of the calls early on, and that I think was a 6-month-long or a year-long process, but you were talking just about the space-time continuum. And you were talking about it in such an incredible way, not just in a kind of the theoretical version of the space, time continuum of past, present, future, but you were talking about it in relationship to very practical housing things, right? And I just thought that it's amazing. I heard that and I thought, wait, stop. What she just said, can she say that again? And ever since then, right, I have been fangirling you. And I got to say, I don't fangirl many people. I don't. When I listen, when I fangirl somebody or fan person somebody, let me tell you, it's because I've heard something really phenomenal. So I want to just bring you on that note. Like when you think about, the notion of time as we do housing work, talk a little bit about that, because I want folks to hear the way you think about it, how you talk about it. Go for it. Have at it.
Yeah, so as you noted, I am an Afrofuturist artist. I use Afrofuturism in my work, and so if folks don't know what Afrofuturism is, right, it's sort of a genre of science fiction or speculative fiction. I think it's a life genre, but most people, kind of put it in the realm of science fiction and speculative fiction, and it's things like Sun Ra Orchestra or Octavia Butler or Black Panther are some of the cultural, sort of things that folks associate with Afrofuturism. But for me, when I came across it back in the early days of being a lawyer, over a decade ago, I was really interested in thinking about how Afrofuturism applies to the realm that I was working in. At the time I was a housing advocate. I was working at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia. I was representing people who were losing their homes to foreclosure, to eviction, and it was becoming increasingly present in terms of how time was working, not just space, not just folks being pushed out of space or evicted from space or foreclosed upon in a physical way in their homes, but also how their futures were being taken from them, how time was being compressed for folks. As a lawyer going into court, understanding that I am in a battle against time, whether it's, the 21 days until my client gets evicted under the system, or thinking about the long-term future of how that eviction record is going to come back to them in 5 years when they've gotten a better job and they're trying to get into a better place, and how that eviction record is going to continue to haunt them. And then even thinking sort of on the bigger scale of systemic issues and how time plays a role when we're thinking about things like redlining or all the things that have happened, in the so-called past that continue to affect us in the present. How do we position that, and how do we talk about that, and how do we think about strategies that reach across time, that don't just address the present moment or the urgency or the crisis, but that can reach across time, that can help us to think about better futures, that can help us to heal, repair the past, and to make sure that there's continuity between those dimensions of time. And so Afrofuturism has really just taught me a lot. It has taught me a lot about time, about hope, about the future, about not thinking about the future as something that's predetermined or only in the control of people who have power and authority, but we all have a stake in the future in some way. And so technologies of hope that lend us, help us to expand our futures is what's really important to me in how I bring it sort of into the work.
I love that. I love that. And I love it for many reasons. I mean, from my vantage point, I love, you mentioned just some of the folks who are who are in the canon of sort of Afrofuturism. I wrote a piece of maybe I guess a year or so ago, just on Octavia Butler, who for me was just wonderful at being able to move, seamlessly through past, present, future, and able to take you back and forth,
Yeah.
right? To have those lessons be learned and have the conversation be fresh. And I will say, from the vantage point of case making, which is what I do with a lot of folks across the country, this navigating that continuum is really hard for people. It really is. Like being able to seamlessly go back and forth in the way you just did, like what's happening here affects the future, but it has to, like there's things that we can do today that all of that is really tough. And so one of the things we always teach in case making is you got to begin to master that continuum. We talk about it as part of a principle too, the second principle of case making, which is you got to be able to position people now for what's happening in the future, and you got to be able to navigate both things.
Yeah.
But I wonder in your work, like when you're bringing lots of different kind of folks together, how you help other folks get on the same, in the same sort of positioning to be able to do that, right? To seamlessly go between the past, present, and future and back in order to make the best case, right, that we need forward. So would love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think one of the ways that I do that is just I feel like people naturally think about and navigate these different areas, right? But when you start to intellectualize it, that's when it becomes a challenge, because people are like, well, how do I do that? But we actually naturally do it. We naturally do it in conversation. We naturally do it when we're reminiscing on something, right? We naturally do it in these different ways, but then when you have to talk about it and when you have to think about like, how does time work, right? It feels very objective. It feels like something that is bound to the clock, not something that we can talk about or manipulate, when it can be more than further from the truth. Each system, each realm has its own set of time or its own way of dealing with time. And again, I talk about like the courtroom, right? Or even talking about things like housing preservation, and thinking about, right, someone who is a homeowner who has a lot more what we call tenure, right? Ability to be stable, ability to be somewhere long term. And part of that ties to how we think about the values of home ownership versus renters. And so when you're thinking about a renter, right, they have less time generally than like a homeowner because of this tenure, because of our value systems as a country, as a society, where we value a certain type of property ownership, right? And that ties back to, early issues around who could own property and under what circumstances people could own property, right? Only certain types of people were able to own property. So when you think about that, and again, think about what that means in the present, what that looks like in the present, that looks like renters having less time in their homes, being subject to systems where they can be pushed out or displaced quicker than homeowners, right? And then even within the home ownership realm, right? If you are a different race, you have a different landscape than some other people do, right? So even as a homeowner, right, even though we as a country tote home ownership as the thing that everybody should be working towards achieving, if you are a low income homeowner, if you're a Black homeowner, if you're a indigenous homeowner, right, your time is truncated in a way, and your space is truncated in a way that other folks aren't, who have certain privileges. And so it comes up. It's a very present aspect of our life. And when I'm case making about these things, I'm just pointing out what is actually pretty obvious, right? Like pointing out that difference between tenure, that difference between who gets impacted by what. And people are like, yes, that actually is my experience. Or yes, I actually do see that when you sort of break it down in this way, right? So it is something that we kind of deal with naturally, but we don't feel that we have the power to question or challenge these kind of things. So that's part of how I do the case making. It's like making things plain that, have been intellectualized to a point where everyday folks don't feel like they can engage in that conversation except for if they're in crisis. And it's like also that's also a thing of time of like when we're in crisis and urgency, we don't have the space or time to really plan, to really strategize, to really vision. And so it's also about giving folks back that ability to have space and time to thrive, to think, to strategize, to plan. So that's the kind of case making that I do, like advocating for folks to see that and then to build out strategies that give them back that space and time and give them that space. And a lot of my work as an artist is about creating that space. And so like one of the projects that I have created is called the Community Futures Lab. And that started off as a storefront sort of community space that we ran in Philly for about a year in a community that was actively undergoing displacement, eminent domain, lots of things, right? And it was just an opportunity for folks to come in anytime they wanted, right? And it was about that like temporality of like, it's your temporality. You choose your temporality. You come in, get resources. You could do an oral history interview with us, complain about what's happening around you, but it's also like activates people's ability to intervene and to be part of conversations that they have been left out of. And you get the most wisest, like creative solutions just from people having that space time to come in and talk and to not do it in the midst of ongoing crisis or in the midst of a moment of crisis, which was the dichotomy as a legal services attorney. Like I have people coming in, I have to immediately deal with their eviction. I can't be like, hey, do you ever heard of Afrofuturism? Let's think about right? So we have to have opportunities to engage with people outside of the crisis model and urgency model. That is absolutely important as well. Like we absolutely need those spaces to be able to address those issues, but we also need other spaces where people can vision, dream, plan, have that space time.
Love that, love that, love that, love that. That is so core, to my thinking around the case making part of the work. We often tell people like you have to be present to the things that folks are needing right now, but being able to help people position themselves in the future is so important. That gives them the space that you were talking about to dream, to think, to plan, and that sort of elevates their optimism about what's possible. So I love that, like you're giving people like literally a physical space to come. Right. We there's some immediate things we gotta handle, but this space to dream, to think what's coming in the future, what's possible. I love the spatial futures work that you've been leading at PolicyLink. I think that is just so phenomenal and just such an integral part of like how you help people like get a sense of their own power in a space that often strips right their sense of their own power. So talk a little bit about that, about how you think about that future state, about how you've seen that happen with people who, get a little space to plan, to vision for the future and what that does to who they are fundamentally, right, as people, right, and their ability to advocate for themselves too.
Yeah, I think it's no less than a revelation for folks sometimes. And again, like I said, right, these are things that are natural as well. But again, when folks get that space, like we see beautiful things emerge from communities, from people who are again the most impacted. And I've seen folks, when they've had that space time, be able to move phenomenal levels of policy in like very short periods of time because folks have again given them the space, given them the time, given them the resources, and have taken them seriously and have them at the table, right? And that's also a part of the sort of space-time continuum of who gets to speak, who gets to be present in the room where decisions are being made and where things are happening. And it's like the more we can, those of us who are in these like middle positions, to be able to make those connections, it's important. Like I see myself as a person that should be used, right? Like I have a privilege. I have a law degree. I have the ability to be in certain spaces. And so when I'm working with community members, I'm like, how do I bring them along? How do I get them into that space so that they can have the time that they need to put forward the vision that's going to actually work? Not the vision that I need to have or the vision that this politician needs to have, but their vision, their strategy, because that's the thing that's going to work. Like we can do all this stuff over here, but if we're not the people that's experiencing it, it's just a Band-Aid and it's going to be a temporary fix. And as much as I love policy and writing policy, if I'm not, I've been in a position where I've been able to write policy as a lawyer without community. And I can tell you, it doesn't work, right? Like it can work, but it's not sustainable. It's not going to be the best solution because the people most impacted have not been in a room to be able to tell you exactly what's going to work and what's not going to work, right? And when we have that knowledge, when we have that expertise, we do better. We have much more sustainable laws. I see we're able to move things quicker. Working in Philadelphia, one of the laws that we worked on, and this will connect back, but one of the laws that we worked on is a policy called the Renters Access Act. And it's a policy that requires landlords, when they are screening tenant applications, to do a more holistic look at that application, right? And it really talks about this thing around eviction records. And again, how eviction records, something that happens in the past, that captures the past, can inevitably make someone's future horrible for the rest of their lives because of that record. And so thinking about how we have laws that address that, right? Having the people in the room who have the eviction records, who can talk about, this is my experience when I'm going to a landlord and they're not giving me a chance to bring back additional information about my circumstances because that eviction record is locked in the past, right? When we were able to form a coalition of folks who are impacted, who have eviction records, to build out that law, that's when we had an effective law. And we were able to get that law passed in like 3 months because, again, the people most impacted were at the forefront pushing it, saying, this is what we need, right? This is what the people need. So that is why, for me, there's no other way to do this work. I have done this work in other ways. I think there's value in doing the work in other ways and doing work that's transactional or individual. There's absolutely a need for that. For me, that don't work no more. I need to be in community. I need to be with the people who have the experiences and have the expertise and know what's needed to resolve this sort of issues that we have.
That's right. That's right. And to your point, I mean, that's exactly what, it's not only, to speed up the process of actually enacting legislation and move that forward, but it's the sustainability over time. I think
Yes.
Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote a piece for the Times just recently, and she was talking about the moment that we're in, which is rolling back a lot of, a lot of the civil rights gains. And she's like, part of the piece that was missing, she said, she mentions many things, but a part of the piece that she said was missing was, we enacted lots of legislation. We sort of, pushed hard to get a lot of civil rights movement things passed. But then the sort of, public will building piece of bringing some stuff behind that,
Yes,
right,
yeah.
to help folks understand what that meant and to keep the sort of pressure focused on that issue. And also just continue to bring people forward who may not have even believed at the time that we should have those civil rights in the first place.
Yes.
To bring some of them forward. You're not going to bring all of them forward because some folks are just whatever, right? But you got to bring some of those forward. And she talks a little bit about that. And that's what I think a part of what you're talking about addresses, unless you are bringing folks with you, right, as part of the process, and they feel deeply invested in that. people across the spectrum, right, then it gets harder to sustain that over time. And it's
Yes.
easy to roll that back when folks are not deeply invested, right, in the same way, shape, or form. Yeah.
Right on, Dr. T. Right on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're seeing this now with some of the AFFH work, right? I don't know if you saw recently that there was an article put out about the hesitancy of finalizing the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. And the Biden administration is now, for reasons not quite clear, holding that up. And I think now, right, advocates are scrambling to push, like, how do we push the White House, right? But we need the people behind us to also put that pressure on. And we haven't done a great job of sustaining interest, knowledge about what AFFH is and what it means to the person on the ground. Not to me, not to the advocate, not to the politician, but to the everyday person. What does this rule mean to you, and why should you be fighting for it? Why should you be interested in it? So that resonates with me so hard across many different issue areas that I work on.
I want to say for that one, I wanted to push a little bit more on that one because you and I both been doing a lot of thinking about that. From my vantage point, the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule it's monumental, and I'm surprised that there aren't more folks like ringing the bell, like, come on, folks, this is super important. Yeah. To my mind, what's really exciting about that is for the first time that I know of, you're going to have housing planning departments all over the country in big cities, large cities, suburban areas, rural areas, having to have conversations that they have never had before with their community residents and having to actually have a plan for what they're going to do relative to the disparities that they find in their communities.
Exactly.
We've never really, like, to something, I don't want to say forced, but let's just say invited people lovingly through the force of the federal government's, right, purse strings to do that, and to have every single one of them have to figure that out is phenomenal, right? And like I always tell people about that particular thing, some of those housing planning agencies and departments are, especially the larger ones, they were going to do that anyway. They don't, right? They'll do it. Some of the smaller ones, they'll sort of be creative, and a whole lot in the middle. Some of whom will come kicking and screaming. They'll hate it. They don't want to do it, but they'll do it. And what they'll do is better than anything they would have done otherwise. Yes. Right? And for a lot of folks, they'll be on a learning journey, which is huge for us, right? In terms of thinking about exactly the stuff you were talking about at the very beginning, like even just the time continuum. Like, why is it that folks who had this one particular moment in their lives, right, if they were evicted for some reason, follow them all the way into their future, right, which doesn't give them the opportunity to create the thing, right, that we all say people deserve, which is the opportunity to have a great life. Exactly. So I love that. So I want to go back just a little bit more. So one of the things we often talk about in case making, especially in that principle too, is that future focus, but having people really understand the power of the moment in relationship to that future. It's not just that you get to plan to the future and say, I want this great future, it's going to be wonderful, da, 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 da. It's that this moment is, that future is being created right now by the decisions that we're making. And so what we do right now matters. And sometimes, in case making, we find that we have to like get people, even in the energy, but get their own sense of agency going. Because a lot of folks have lost the sense that they have any real power. And so like, I don't want to do that. These folks, they're not listening to me. I'm not going to that city council meeting. I'm not going to this meeting. I'm not, I'm not going to this, tenants' right meeting. I'm not going to that because these people, and they have this whole long sense of, I would call it negative disruptions that aren't really born out of their lack of desire to be part of it. Right. It's the sense of, powerlessness. Yes. And so a part of our work is to talk people like back into their power. Like, listen, folks, do you know all the stuff we have been through to get here? Do you know all the stuff we've done in the past? Like, listen, don't stop now. Right? So I know that in the work that you do, which is a lot of movement building, right? You really get that, right? And have to hone like that work. So talk a little bit about like, what does that look like in the work that you do? Like, what do you think about that? Have at it.
Yeah, I love what you just said about talking people back into their power, because that's so much of what the work is, right? And again, I think what I've been able to do is recognize early on, even though, right, like I have my own life circumstances where I'm coming from, some similar circumstances as some of my former clients or the people that I work with, but in this present moment, in the now, right, I have a lot of different privileges of, again, being able to be in certain spaces because of a degree, because of a title, whatever it may be. And so for myself, recognizing that early on and spending that privilege, like figuring out how I can like take myself out of the equation and bring folks in and put them in the place where I am and where folks can see, yeah, as you said, talk them back into their power. And so that's kind of how I do approach some of the movement building work. Really try to not not be the expert in the room, to transition or transfer that designation to other folks who actually are, have the lived experience, lived expertise. And I have been kept honest by organizers, like being able to work closely with organizers who, right, are cognizant of power, very cognizant, and are often able to work with folks who've been disenfranchised for a long time in a sort of more long-term way. Like in my work, former work as a legal services attorney, right? Like a lot of the work, as I said, was very crisis driven and having to deal with issues in the moment. But working with organizers, right, they can do some of that transitional work of like from that moment to the longer term to like what we need to build in order to actually transform the system and not just transform the individual circumstances. And so I couldn't do this work if I didn't work with organizers who are on the ground, who have that piece of it, right? And I get the privilege of doing a lot of intellectual work and a lot of visioning work with folks and a lot of like working with them to help strategize, right? But I'm not the one on the ground, in a lot of these circumstances. I'm not the one knocking on doors or, busting in City Hall saying what needs to be said. And so, again, giving folks the resources to be able to do that and the encouragement to do that, I think goes a long way for folks realizing that and then taking it over. And like, I've been amazed. It's been such a privilege. I'll talk about this one person who I continue to work with from Philly, from my work in Philadelphia, Miss Karen Harvey, who was a person who was living in a building that was being mass evicted in one fell swoop, basically. About 300 people, mostly Black folks, mostly disabled, elder folks. And so one of the things that we did at that time when I was working in legal services was I was able to represent folks. I filed some discrimination cases, but folks were still being evicted, right? And there's only but so much you can do in that position. So we were able to work with organizers. Organizers set up blockades. They helped folks move. They, for the people who we couldn't represent because they didn't qualify for some reason, right? They worked with those folks. We were able to make some templates for them to like be able to work with those folks to file their own lawsuits. So again, and then from there, based on the work that the organizers were doing in sort of collaboration with other advocates and the people who actually lived there, they were able to, in a couple months, get a just cause eviction law passed. And then Ms. Karen, who was living in a building, who's an elderly retired social worker, is now the leader of the Philadelphia Rent Control campaign following that, right? So just that trajectory of someone who's facing eviction, facing displacement, her whole entire community displaced, but then was able to step into this leadership role and continues that. This was like 7-8 years ago, continues that and continues to build that work. And now Philadelphia is a place that is becoming increasingly known for some of its housing justice protections because of these kinds of collaborations where the people most impacted have the opportunity to be in leadership positions because, again, they know best. They know the strategies. They know what needs to be done. So that's an example of some of the ways I've been able to work. But yeah, working with organizers, working with people most impacted, again, is my North Star of how I do this work.
I love that. I love that. And I love that, not just talking somebody back into their power, but then watching their evolution over time to be able to take that power and wield it, not just in one kind of transactional, we get this thing passed,
Yes.
but now I can be as an everyday hero and leader in my community and shepherding a whole range, a whole generation, right, of things that can help this community. And that is really powerful. I mean, that gets to, I think, what Nicole Hannah-Jones was talking about in terms of just like the long tail, right, of that work that we needed to do, right, that didn't quite make it into, right, the next phase of the work. But I love that you talked about that. I want to talk about something similar. I was just talking to somebody recently, and they were sharing that a part of their journey was also watching the evolution of people that they needed to kind of make the case too, who were in fierce opposition when they first started having those conversations, like, no, I'm not doing tenants right. I don't care about that stuff. Or no, I'm not talking that affordable housing stuff. Don't bring that stuff here. Right. It's those people. I mean, just the worst of the worst of the worst. And she was talking about, watching the evolution of some of those folks, right? They've gone from, oh no, don't bring those folks here, to, oh wait a minute, but and now seeing some of those folks, not all of them obviously, but some of those folks now being the most fierce, I would say, advocates for, at very least, affordable housing in their communities. And she was talking about, like, not writing off.
Yeah.
Even, some of these folks, you can peel them off. Their circumstances change in life, and all of a sudden, their daughters or sons are in a position where they need it. All of a sudden, they're the first ones, like, wait, that affordable housing stuff y'all were talking about, can we get a little bit of that? Right. So talk about that, like how because I know you've worked across, right, a whole range of different audiences, bringing them forward. So talk to me a little bit about how you sort of bring some of these folks forward, even folks who at the moment that you talk to them may not quite be ready. Right. But, over time, some of them are going to be able to get peeled off into our movement.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I have found that different things work for different people and circumstances in this work. And, sometimes it's appealing to things like, okay, this ain't going to cost you as much as you think it's going to, right? Like that kind of thing, right? Like, so just thinking about some of our work in Philadelphia around trying to bring right to counsel for tenants, and where we started, right, which is that, right to counsel, folks didn't know what it was. They didn't understand the utility of it. Why are we just trying to put more lawyers in a courtroom? It didn't make sense to people. But then for some people, right, it was appealing to the humanity and to the justice of, the injustice of the power imbalance in court. For some people, it was just a money factor. So for some people, it was just doing a cost-benefit analysis to say that, okay, you put a right to counsel program, you're saving millions of dollars on homelessness services, on hospital and medical things that people who are unhoused have to access, right? So you have to kind of understand what appeals to different people, and understanding that a one size fits all message does not work, right? And you want it to work, you want it to be that, like, appealing to humanity and basic needs works for everybody, but it doesn't, and that's the diversity of us as humans, and so figuring out what are those different things that either different groups of people, or in some cases it's an individual who holds a power or who holds a vote that you need to convince. And maybe you don't need to convince them for the long term. Maybe you're convincing them in that moment, right? So it's also those different scales of time as well, of like, who do you need to convince long term? Who in the city council, right, needs to be convinced to be able to vote to get this thing in place? And then we can think through the long term then, right? So I think it's some of that. But I think one of my go-to moves is like sort of just, again, I try to appeal to the interconnectedness of housing with sort of other critical areas of life and social policy, right? So thinking about affordable housing is health and society and economy, right? When we have housing for everybody, it's a cornerstone of a healthy society. And sort of reminding stakeholders of that multiplier effect of stable housing. It improves educational outcomes, it reduces healthcare costs. Some of that can sometimes be helpful in sort of swaying people who, again, aren't just persuaded by the basic justice aspect or the basic humanity aspect. And I think one of the things is, again, that interconnectedness is really important also between different policies. So thinking about, for example, in Philadelphia, right to counsel for tenants is not just its own policy that should be siloed out as its own solution, but we need to connect that to eviction diversion. We need to connect that to rental assistance and see this as a full program that is interconnected and that makes the program more effective, makes each component of the program more effective. So when you have right to counsel connected to rental assistance, connected to eviction diversion, you can get rid of some of those cases that don't need to go through court, that don't need to have somebody get an eviction record that's going to follow them for the rest of their life. We can just apply for rental assistance, get that money drawn down. But then if that relationship breaks down, or if it's not about money, guess what? It's automatically connected to the Right to Counsel program, so you can get an attorney to help you figure out the challenging pieces. So that's another piece of it, is just making sure that folks see these things as interconnected. And that can be helpful, especially if you're in a place where like it's about budget and people don't have are thinking they don't have the resources to do this, but they have the resources to do that. Talk about how those things are connected. Talk about how the homelessness system is absolutely connected to the housing system, is absolutely connected to the eviction system, and that by connecting these things, you are actually being more efficient and saving your resources versus spending wildly, and then you have no proof of concept that these things are working. They're not working because they're not connected. So that's kind of how I sort of try to do some of the case making with folks who are, sort of oppositional or on the other side or not quite yet convinced.
I love that. I love that. And I think that's exactly right. And I think, it's we don't have enough, to your point, we don't often have enough, right, in our kind of, popular culture, media, et cetera, talking about those interconnections. And so we keep losing track of that, right? Thinking of ourselves as individual homeowners, individual folks who are renting an apartment, individual folks who are sending their kids to school, right? Individual folks who are in the workforce. But all those, not only are their sectors related, but our ability to participate in all of those sectors as individuals, right, is related to our collective, right? You don't get the success of these individual places or individual people without the bigger collective. And we don't hear enough about that. That was one of the things I think was somewhat, I don't want to use the word helpful, but at least was a effect of the pandemic.
Yes.
Which was all of a sudden people started figuring out that there were these connections. They were like, well, the pandemic, okay, so wait, a whole lot of kids in this country get their only meal or one of their only meals a day in schools. So if schools are shut down, so how do we get these kids to, right? They were like, because they didn't realize that all these things are connected. Okay, so wait, a whole lot of folks, in order to get to work, we rely on the kind of transportation, they rely on this. And if we don't have this, and we don't have that, then how do we, and it forced us, right, to start to think about like, what are these connections and how are we using them? And to good effect, at least, I think a lot of us who work in the social justice movements, like, we're like, well, duh, hello, right? These things fit together. And if you give us a little bit of bandwidth and some resources, we can tell you how to maximize those connections. And I think a lot of that happened during the pandemic. And then, right, people started going back after the pandemic, right, to business as usual. And so a lot of those connections and the way people think about, who's providing your food, right? Who's at the grocery store? Who's at the hospital? All those kind of things are going back to like, right? The privileges of not having to think about those interconnections. So I love when you talked about that, because we need to be constantly reminded, not just during a pandemic, but every day, that your success as a person, as a family, whatever it is connected to every other family, right, around you, right, and in the world. And that, man, is such a powerful, case to be made, right, if we would just make that more often.
Yes. And it's exactly everything you just said. And it's so hard to sustain that understanding when all the messages that we get are telling us the opposite, are telling us every single thing, every commercial that we see, every time we go out, we are being told you are an individual. Your struggle is not interconnected with the person next to you. And so if we're constantly being bombarded with those messages, how do we cut through it, and where do we cut through, and how do we get people to see that we're all together in this? What happens to you is going to affect me tomorrow, maybe not today, but at some point. I think it's challenging for people to keep that in mind. And what we saw with the pandemic, exactly what you said, like people came together, we were able to pass policy so quickly. And it's like, we should have been doing this. But as you said, it wasn't sustained, right? We were able to go back to business as usual very quickly because whatever it was, like the roots didn't run deep enough. We didn't actually get into the infrastructure of like our thinking and our society's design around policy and justice, whatever it is, right? It hasn't been able to be sustained. But that moment was so good. That moment was really good.
Yeah, and I in the conversations, I do listening sessions all over the country, and I have people replay that, They talk about, wow, during the pandemic, we got so much stuff done. I was just having a conversation with a lot of public health professionals across the country. And they're like, man, we were just able to do so much good stuff in communities because we had the resources to do that and the bandwidth, and nobody was saying no because everybody wanted to be safe. They're like, whatever you're going to do, just do it, right? And because of that, like, we really got to see what public health could do, even though there were some folks who didn't want to wear a mask, and no, there was some of that, right? But the ability to unleash, right? Professionals who do this, to listen to their advice and counsel, to have them partner with communities in new ways, like, that's the way to do it. And so I think a part of our opportunity and our challenge is, right, to, even though folks are trying to go back to business as usual, to say, no, we're going to sustain the gains that we had. Because we just saw lots of municipalities solve homelessness, even if it was for a short time. During that pandemic, lots of folks opened up these motels. We got people off the street. So don't tell me we can't do it because we just did it, right?
We did it.
Right. Don't tell me we can't stop evictions, right? And stop, right, moving people out of their homes, because we did it. We had an eviction moratorium for many places that was more, 18 months or so?
Exactly.
So we can do that, right? We can figure this out. And so now I think the opportunity for us is to figure out how to lean into a narrative that says, don't tell me we can't. We can, and we did. So the only question is, how do we continue and expand and scale what we already know works? And that is right, that's always the opportunity and the challenge, right? So I want to ask you this, in this particular moment, there is so much particularly in the housing space, but I think across, I would say, the social justice continuum, right? So much that is happening that is giving folks, at least, on one hand, a little bit of agita, on the other hand, just full-fledged, like, oh my God, like the stuff that's happening with DEI and the stuff across the board, affirmative action, the Supreme Court, is about to take up this issue around homelessness, and the kind of, even just the foolishness of that case, right, that we're about to have a conversation about, which is, it's essentially, can you criminalize the act of being homeless when we don't provide a house for anybody? Like, just in terms of the thought about that, it's so silly. Like, I don't even know how we even got here, but okay, we're here. And there are lots of folks who are, demoralized by having to go back and fight for the stuff that we already won, right? Like, we did that. We fought that. We already won. Really. So in this particular moment, one of the things that, I'm often telling folks to do, and I feel this in the work that I see you all doing at PolicyLink, is, being the inspiration for the field. Come on, folks. Yes, this is the moment. Yes, right. Some of these issues are being rolled back, and yes, we got to go re-up, right, for another opportunity to make our case around why it matters, that the right to vote is given to everybody without, right, any kind of unfettered, like why it matters that people have access to universities and jobs, and why it matters that we're having to do that. So I want to just ask you, as you think about this work, what is it that keeps you optimistic, especially somebody in the legal profession, where you see just the legal, the sort of legal jurisprudence being, going by the wayside, like 50 years of history of women's reproductive rights, gone, like 70 years of civil rights, gone, like in a day, and like, the march toward that. What it is that keeps you coming back to your desk, like, what? It's a new day, let's do it. Like, whatever the fight is, I'm here for all of it. I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, what has fundamentally changed my idea of hope that I continue to hold on to is Afrofuturism, and how I am able to think about time. And for me, it is that it goes back to, again, not seeing the outcome of these things as like we're going towards some utopia, or there's some specific time on the clock and on the calendar where we will reach this perfect, amazing thing. But understanding that, every day is different, that we create time together, that time is not something that's set out, like there's not a year 2029 that's just there waiting for us to come to, but we create it together. We create the conditions, we create the space, we create the time. And so as long as I know that we have that power, and that is something that is inherent in all of us. That's not something they can try to take it away, and they do try to take it away, right? But if we can step back into that we are, as a collective, we create time, we create what the future looks like. The future is not something that's set out already, predetermined, right? The future doesn't have to depend on the present. The future doesn't have to depend on what's happened in the past. We could actually create something new. We can get something different. Or we could even go back to the past. We can go back to ancestral practices and ancestral ways of indigenous and Black ways of talking to the land and being in relationship with the land and thinking about housing. Like, we can do that too. Like, it's open. Time is open in that way. And so that's what makes me feel hopeful. The fact that, I can hold that, and I can also understand history in the sense that we've always struggled. There's always been cycles of things that come, right? Like, we've been in a cycle for the past year or two of, like, general smoothness, and now we're entering back into a bad period, and we got to fight, and this is a time to wake up and get active. And then maybe there will come a time where we can be a little bit more in peace or strategizing mode, right? So I kind of think of it like that, and that makes me feel a little bit hopeful. I know it's not like the end answer, right? Or it may not be something that other folks can sort of take, but Afrofuturism and thinking about time and sort of fundamentally shifting how I see time has changed my whole worldview and how I approach this work. And so that's why things like the Spatial Futures Fellows, being able to work with folks who are out in their communities, just doing innovative work that brings in repair, that brings in these different dimensions of time, the now, the past, the present, the future. It just gives me, being able to see these things also gives me hope, right? Like, yes, there's these big things happening nationally and in the world and everywhere, right? But when you see what folks are actually doing in their communities on a daily basis, that is, amazing work that is moving the needle for their communities, even if it feels like it's small, it's not. It's no less than a person's life and a community's life, and that's huge, right? So just also thinking about that scale, right? Like, sometimes the big things that are very present that implicates every single person can be the thing that brings us down, and we can feel hopeless because it's so big. But when you look at and you're able to work with people who are in their communities doing what they need to do, and that can be a beacon of hope for all of us, and that can be an example of how it can be done, even if it's not, again, scaling to everything in the world, like that gives me a lot of hope. So
I love that. And you just described the justice journey, right, that you are on, and some of the ways that folks can join you. So we're going to make sure that as when we put out the episode that we make sure that people got all of your connective, links and things to Spatial Futures and PolicyLink, and maybe even some of the installations that you've done as an artist, which I think are fabulous, including your book that you have that helps to explain kind of the foundations of how you think about Afrofuturism, because I think people can really benefit about that. You are just
and I'm
phenomenal.
also coming out with a book in January of 2025 that's going to be published on AK Press about time, called Dismantling the Master's Clock on Race, Space, and Time. So folks will be able to read all about this stuff.
Love it. Well, you are just phenomenal. Thank you so much for taking a little bit of time out of your schedule to join us, to be really giving people, inspiration for how they can also be fierce in their case making, right? This is not a time to have a voice that's quiet. This is a time to speak up, right? About all the things that we want to see in that future. So for those of you who are watching, I want to say, just as we close out this session, the principles of strategic case making, they work if you work them, right? Rasheedah, you just gave so many examples, right? That are all the way up and down what I would consider to be great, case making, bringing people to our work. And I would say, be inspired, right, by the fierce case making that y'all just heard, because this is phenomenal. And I think when we are all leaning into our case making, particularly the fierceness of it, that's when we get to reimagine how justice wins. Thank y'all for joining us today. And thank you, Rasheedah, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye, guys. Thanks so much for joining me today. Every new conversation we have with a fierce case maker gives me new energy for the road. And I hope that as you listen today, you felt the same way. I believe in case makers everywhere. And if you don't quite see the fierce case maker in you just yet, hold on, just trust. Work those principles so that you can bring new champions to your justice journey. And if this information inspired you, then please be sure to like, share, and subscribe so that you can be one of the first folks who knows when a new episode is dropped. And until next time, stay fierce.